In the 700s, there was a priest who was really struggling with his Catholic faith in regards to the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. He was struggling to believe that when he celebrated Mass and he said the words of consecration over the host and over the wine, that they actually became Jesus' body and blood. That's a really distressing thing for a priest who celebrates the Mass so regularly and who preaches about the importance of the Eucharist. It's hard when a priest is struggling with his faith in regard to the Eucharist. But then one day while he's celebrating Mass, he says the words of consecration over the host, and it transformed, it physically transformed in his hands. This piece of bread became this yellowish, brownish substance. It became soft, like a piece of flesh. And then as he said the words of consecration over the cup, he watched the wine transform into blood that then coagulated into these 5 globules. He immediately was aware that he was in the presence of a miracle, a Eucharistic miracle. So he called around himself all of the congregation who was present at Mass to stand around the altar and now witness with their own eyes what had just happened, that Jesus had become in some ways physically present, visible to the eyes as flesh and blood. And then after that Mass, these elements were then placed inside of what we would call a reliquary for display, kind of behind a little piece of glass with some ornamentation around it. And it has been venerated since the 700s in Lanciano, Italy, as a Eucharistic miracle. Come the 1900s, we're culturally living in a time where people are much more scientifically oriented, right? We're maybe more skeptical about things like that. And we want to know if things are real, if we want to know if things are true and if they can be proven scientifically. And so the Bishop of Lanciano, with the blessing of the Pope, invited a scientist to do some studies on this. So he invited an Italian professor of anatomy and a researcher and a scientist named Dr. Eduardo Linoli to do some studies on these elements, this apparent flesh and blood. It was really interesting seeing what the conclusions were of this professor, this scientist, as he does these experiments in 1970, 1971. He notices that these globules of blood, that he can test them and see what blood type they are. He was able to identify that there were elements in the blood that made it clear that this is probably the blood of a person who lived in the Middle East. They could see within the blood that there's proteins present in the blood that you would expect to find in the blood of a person who is living. Normally when blood is removed from the body, it decomposes. It begins to deteriorate. Blood decomposes about 8 to 10 days after being removed from the body, or if even within the body, as if a person has died, then the blood deteriorates 8 to 10 days later. But here he is staring at blood underneath a microscope, and it has not been in a hermetically sealed container for the last 1,200 years. And here it is, and he can't understand it. It's such a fascinating phenomenon. Then as he looks at this piece of flesh, he's able to quickly identify that this is definitely human flesh. It is cardiac material. It is from the heart. It is a sliver of the heart, and you can identify the different elements that's there. One thing that was noted was that the way that it is cut would have required the precision of a very skilled surgeon to be able to cut the flesh of the heart in such a precise way. And again, it's fascinating to note that it is still here. It's 1,200 years old. When a person dies, their internal organs deteriorate within 24 or 72 hours. Right? They're already breaking down and decomposing. But here he's looking at cardiac tissue underneath a microscope that is doing just fine. It's vibrant. There's a life in it somehow still. A couple years later, the World Health Organization, WHO, was invited to do some further studies to confirm or deny Dr. Linoli's conclusions, and they backed up everything that he said. And they finished their report by acknowledging that, from what they can tell, science has come to its own limits, that science cannot explain how this is possible. that this is just too confusing. So it's really fascinating kind of looking at this. As a Catholic who believes in the real presence, for me, this bolsters my faith. This is just inspiring for me. It's great for me to hear. I think sometimes for the person who doesn't believe in the real presence, who doesn't believe that Jesus is present in the Eucharist, this can be confusing. It might kind of spark some curiosity, and I think that's the hope that we might have as Catholics in talking about Eucharistic miracles. There's so many. I think there's over 100, 150 Eucharistic miracles that we have recorded throughout history, and they can be kind of inspiring. They can at least spark some curiosity for us. In the Gospel this weekend, Jesus is talking about himself as the bread of life, the bread from heaven. We've been reading from John chapter 6 now for the last few weeks, and we're not quite finished with it yet. And in this passage right now, Jesus has just finished talking about the bread from heaven from the book of Exodus, the manna that God provided in the desert. And it says here now that the people begin to murmur against Jesus. Interesting, that word, murmur. It doesn't come up that many times in the scriptures, obviously. It's not a common word. In the scriptures, it means to complain. If you're murmuring about something, you are complaining about something. And the primary time that we see it in the scriptures is in the books of Exodus and Numbers. The people are murmuring against God. They are complaining about this manna that God has given to them, this bread from heaven that every morning it's on the ground. They have to collect it up. It's a lot of work to do that every day, and it doesn't taste amazing. They would rather have filet mignon or something like that. And so there's a disappointment. They are unimpressed with the bread that God has provided. So it's interesting here in this gospel as Jesus talks about himself as the true bread from heaven. Once again, the people are murmuring. They are unimpressed. As they say in the gospel today, that they seem to know Jesus, right? This is the son of the carpenter. This is the son of Joseph and Mary. They are unimpressed. Jesus doesn't appear to be someone who's from heaven, so they doubt. And ultimately, many of them are going to walk away from Jesus. We'll get to that as we continue reading through John chapter 6. As Catholics, I think it's okay for us to have our doubts about the Eucharist. It's not an easy thing to wrap our mind around. There is an element to it that's confusing. What does it mean when someone says that my body is true food and my blood is true drink? That's hard for us to understand. He doesn't seem to be using it in some merely metaphorical way. He's very clear. He keeps doubling down on this fact that we have to eat his body and drink his blood. And so I think that as we consider this passage and as we consider even in light of the Eucharistic miracles, it's an invitation for us to explore a little more deeply. It's fine to have our doubts, but don't stay in the doubt. Don't remain in that place of questioning and maybe even just settling on the fact that it doesn't make sense, therefore I'm not going to believe it. I think we're invited to continue to explore, allow these things to pique our curiosity, allow the doubt to spur us on to seeking the truth. Seek out what does Jesus teach about this? What does the scriptures actually have to say about this? And I think as we dive in to the Gospels, as we dive into St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, what he has to say about the Eucharist, as we look at what the early church believed and what the early church practiced, and I think as we look through all of the evidence, we will find that this is consistently taught, that Jesus really truly does become present in the Eucharist, not just at the Last Supper, but at every Mass celebrated after that by every priest. And if we explore that, and if we come to that conclusion, we're going to begin to discover that miracles don't just happen sometimes, right? Eucharistic miracles, there's only a limited number of them that have ever happened in history. We don't actually have to be that special person who gets to be present when some Eucharistic miracle happens. I think as we explore what the real presence means, what Jesus was really teaching in the scriptures about his body and blood, we will discover that a miracle happens every time we go to Mass. Every time the priest says the words of consecration over the bread and over the wine, it actually does change. into Jesus' body and blood, every time we come to Mass, you and I get to be witnesses to a real miracle.